So welcome. You're part of now the Indigenous Sovereignties launch for the American University campus in some ways, right? So I'm going to turn to Garrett to say a few words of introduction. She'll introduce Veronica, and then we're off to the program.
Yes. Hello, good people. The first order of business is thanking our esteemed professors Gould, Rosser, Snape, and Phillips. But before we get into introducing them, I wanted to introduce Veronica Lineberry. I'm so honored to be working with her and learning from her as a collaborator and on her brilliant dissertation, which is coming very soon. It is actually like 4 different dissertations packed into one. It is so big. It's so ambitious and successful in looking at agricultural biodiversity-based land claims by indigenous groups and Afro-descendant groups in Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and in the US, Turtle Island itself, the Eastern Cherokee Band. Veronica is a Ford Fellow. She's also a Fulbright alum, and she has activist roots as well as scholar activist roots in Appalachia, and has done extraordinary work across the hemisphere and in India and in Norway and other collaborations that we have through School of International Service. She's also we're very proud to say, our inaugural postdoc. So at CC is really thinking about Veronica's work and all of the kind of engaged, community-led action research that she's been doing across the continents, but also her really groundbreaking work in Indigenous sovereignties and the broader theoretical frameworks of policy transformation grounded in Indigenous sovereignties. So Veronica, we're so happy to have you lead this launch of Indigenous sovereignties. It's one of the pillars and key focuses of our CC program, Center for Environment Community Equity, moving forward. So it's a historical gathering, really. And Veronica, we're so honored to have you here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much for being here. Thank all of you for being here, for all the work you're doing, the activism, the scholarship, bringing that to this part of the world, to campus, to DC, and abroad and beyond. We're so excited. So yeah, as Garrett just said, this is our inaugural event to highlight Indigenous sovereignties, ecologies, law, policy, what that may mean, how we kind of unpack that, and especially what that means for us here at AU and what CC as a center can do to support this and really kind of center this work and the work that our amazing scholars are doing. So to start off with, of course, we are on land of many tribes, historically and now, right? Very importantly, a few of these tribes have gained some recognition. A huge celebration that just happened last spring starting, is the Papahannock tribe reacquired over 400 acres of its sacred lands in Northern Virginia. And so land back is happening right now in DC, around DC. These tribes are still fighting to be seen, still live on this land today. And so I just want to make sure we're all here in this room, aware of that, aware of whose space we're on, the sacred land that we're on, and the contemporary fights that are still happening to protect this land, get this land back, and on and on. And we'll hear a lot more about that here in just a minute. And so also, I think, do we have student representatives from the Indigenous Initiative? Excellent, yes. And so we have a great student group, because I know most of us here are faculty, some are grad students. And I really want to make sure you're aware of what the students are doing on campus to support this work. They are there, they need your support and mentorship. Also, they have really great projects and plans that need to be supported. So I will go ahead and turn it over to you just to introduce.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Alia. I'm the outreach coordinator for the Indigenous Initiative. It's part of the SAS Undergrad Council, and it was started by our president, who's actually abroad right now, Olivia. And basically, the mission of this initiative is to bring awareness to Indigenous communities, specifically globally, not only within the Americas, but expanded to bring attention to issues that are happening all over the world. And our goal and mission statement is to not only bring back issues like bringing back movements and murals and art and history and educate other people about these opportunities, but also bring other people into the life and help support these communities as well.
So excited to have you all in this work here, because it's very diverse. It's very powerful. I've seen, so they have an Instagram as well. to follow. Do you all have a Twitter too? I can't remember. If you have a Twitter as well, or
We do not have a Twitter.
Okay. Okay, yes, you can see the events, really amazing things that they have been doing, so please check it out. All right, and now, without further ado, we're turning it over to our amazing scholars, practitioners, and activists here who are just really, these are the folks doing the work on campus. So we're here to hear from them. So what we'll go ahead and do is start, introduce yourself and your work. We have a couple of folks with slides, so we'll start with Dr. Rule. Ezra Rosser, and then Victoria Phillips, and then Bill Snape. And so we'll go in that order, and then I'll give us an overview. We'll do a little bit of Q&A afterwards, and we'll think about the themes and connections, and also how this could be moved forward at AU, and kind of what we think the next steps are. So I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Dr. Wu.
Great, sure. Okay, perfect. And how would you like me to do the slides? Just next slide. Okay, sure. And do I need to use this or? Okay, sure. Is that better? Okay, wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to be here, and I want to thank both, of course, my panelists up here today, as well as the key organizers of this convening, particularly Veronica, for doing so much of the coordination that made this gathering possible so that we can have a space on the AU campus where we're discussing the very important issue of Indigenous lands and representations in the Washington, D.C. area, as well as some of the synergies across the university that are too often siloed, right, and don't have the opportunity for interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary and cross-school conversation. So very grateful to be here today. A few things about me. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, and I'm also an assistant professor of critical race, gender, and culture studies in the CAS here at AU. I'm in my second year on the tenure track, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about one of my current research projects, which is the Guide to Indigenous Lands Project. Next slide, please. All right, so the Guide to Indigenous Lands Project is an initiative I started back in 2019 using the development of mobile applications and digital maps as a way to do a couple of key things here, right? So the first is I'm interested in using mapping as a way of reclaiming our narrative as Native peoples. And what I really mean by that, right, is that this is a project that is designed specifically to confront pieces of misinformation and stereotype that circulate around Indigenous peoples today. It's not an understatement at all to suggest that many members of the public have simply no idea that any Native peoples exist in the US at all. And if we can cross that initial barrier, right, then we have the next challenge of convincing and showing and educating them that Indigenous peoples don't all live in teepees and walk around in pre-contact and pre-colonial garb all the time, right? And instead that we are doing things like activism, advocacy, and education here in our nation's capital. So in this way, I'm looking at mapping as a way to reclaim our narrative, right? By challenging some of those pieces of misinformation. I'm also using mapping then as a way of defending our Native stories, right? So often we have materials that are written about us, but not necessarily by us or with our partnership or with our input. And certainly we have a small minority of cases where Indigenous perspectives are really centered, right? And in that way, I'm looking at mapping as a way of centering precisely those Indigenous voices, perspectives that are so often marginalized. In this project, they really come to the fore. And then finally, I'm using mapping as a way of decolonizing our future. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about what I specifically mean there. So this actually goes back to the origin of this project. See one of my students out there looking in. And the origin of this project is that at the time, I was actually working with all Native student cohorts and bringing them to Washington, D.C. This was during the time when I was directing the Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy at George Washington University and running the Native American Political Leadership Program. So what we did was we brought Native students to campus, we hooked them up with internships, usually in a Native serving nonprofit or on Capitol Hill, and then they also took courses with me in the areas of federal Indian law and Indigenous feminisms. And during that process, many of my students actually came to me and they said, as Indigenous students, as Indigenous youth, we actually feel very uncomfortable and out of place in Washington, D.C., right? Not only were many of my students homesick, but they also felt fundamentally not represented in the environment around them, right? In many cases, they were the only Indigenous person in their office, right? Or at the time also, we were still fighting to have the Washington football team name changed, right? And so there are various forces of alienation at play. And what I wanted to do through mapping was develop an educational resource that would curate the community knowledge that I had been given and was privy to as an Indigenous person myself who relocated to this area, right? So through my involvement with community, conversations with folks, I got to know the really rich and deep and diverse history of Washington, D.C., not only as the traditional ancestral homelands of Indigenous groups, but also as a contemporary urban diaspora made up of Indigenous peoples from all across the country who came here precisely to do advocacy work, right? And in that way, I showed my students that they're not alone in this journey, and I would say this is true for all Native students and all Indigenous peoples that come to Washington, D.C., right? That they're not alone, but actually in many ways following in the footsteps of their ancestors who for centuries have come here as part of delegations to work on a nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship level with the U.S. federal government and their home tribal governments. Next slide, please. So this all led to the creation of the Guide to Indigenous DC, which is a free and publicly accessible mobile application. It's available on both Android and iOS platforms, so if you have either of those devices, I encourage you to actually get on your phone and download it right now if you'd like to take a look and follow along in a more interactive way. Next slide, please. And what users of the Guide to Indigenous DC are going to actually see are 17 sites of Indigenous significance spread throughout the Washington, DC area. Now, the point of this project is again to show how all of this land is Indigenous land. And that said, there are many more sites of Indigenous significance than just the 17 that are listed here. But these are 17 that I selected to primarily address those issues that I laid up front, right? Decolonizing Indigenous futures, defending our stories, right? And in that way, these 17 sites are designed to do a couple of things. First, they're designed to represent both Indigenous issues historically as well as in the present. And actually, through my methodological growth doing this research project, I also came to understand how this project fundamentally speaks to Indigenous futures, right? Not only that DC has always been an Indigenous place and is still an Indigenous place, but also it will continue to be an Indigenous place. These sites also are highly interdisciplinary in nature. So we have sites ranging from monuments, memorials, and museums to places of Indigenous arts, sites of Indigenous activism, and locations that speak to Indigenous political activity in our nation's capital. Next slide, please. And so just to give you one quick sense of what some of these scholarly interventions are that I'm making, is that the first site is going to be the U.S. Marine Corps War Memorial. Now, how many of us have actually been to this site? Okay, maybe half or the majority of us. And if we haven't necessarily been there, how many of us have seen this iconic image? Almost all of us, right? It's iconic. It exists in the American imaginary in a very particular way. It receives millions of visitors to the Washington, D.C. area every year. But even when we have such a hyper visible and iconic and representative location, the lesser told story is that one of those service members depicted hoisting the flag of victory at Iwo Jima is this gentleman here, a Pima man by the name of Ira Hayes, right? And so this is, again, an introduction to the types of interventions that I'm trying to make through this work. This project not only uncovers and tells the stories that are not often told, but it also speaks to how we have Indigenous representation and contributions in plain sight that nevertheless don't get much time and attention. Next slide, please. We also have places like the Embassy of Tribal Nations, right? DC is synonymous with international relations. Its importance, of course, as our nation's capital, and Embassy Row, which we're all familiar with. What people may not realize is that there's also an Embassy of Tribal Nations, a place that facilitates the government-to-government relationship, again, between tribal nations that are organized as sovereign, self-governing governments, right, and the federal US government. Next slide, please. And then finally, we have artistic sites like this, Bill Reed's Spirit of Haida Gwaii, which sits outside of the Canadian Embassy. A very quick story I like to tell about this site is that I was actually living less than a mile away from this internationally acclaimed Haida artist's masterpiece work, right? But it took me traveling to Vancouver, right? I had to travel internationally from coast to coast across a national border. And I was in the Vancouver International Airport looking at this magnificent sculpture, taking pictures, reading the plaque, and I learned, I can't believe it, there's a counterpoint cast in a different color less than a mile away from where I live, right? So again, if I'm the target audience, I'm an art lover, I'm an Indigenous person, right? I work, my scholarship is about Canada, and if I don't know about this site, it's highly likely that other people don't know either. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about where I'm going with this project. I have a full-length monograph coming out actually next month with Georgetown University Press that acts as a counterpoint to the Digital and Public Humanities project that is the map and the app. This is going to be for folks who want to do a deeper dive and get more into the scholarly interventions that I make around Indigenous DC. Next slide, please. And then I also have additional sites. So part of the Guide to Indigenous Lands project is to build this out and ultimately cover every major city, state, and tribal territory across the state as well as internationally. So to that end, we also launched a Guide to Indigenous Baltimore in November of 2021. Next slide, please. Very similar premise. This was a partnership between myself and another Indigenous scholar who's now a curator at the National Museum of the American Indian, and her work with her, again, urban Indigenous Lumbee community in Baltimore. Next slide, please. And through this, we can get a sense of both contemporary sites that exist to serve the Native community, like the Baltimore American Indian Center, and more historical sites like the intertribal restaurant that's depicted here, which closed in 1991, no longer exists, and is now Tacos Jalisco. In this way, through mapping, you can get a sense of, again, how we establish, remember, and memorialize through an embodied presence in these places, the Indigenous significance of these areas. Next slide, please. Most recently, I also launched a guide to Indigenous Maryland, which was a collaboration between myself and the state of Maryland. Next slide, please. And here, again, we actually deployed a different methodological approach that sought public input in order to curate, again, a representational subset of Indigenous sites across the state. Next slide, please. One of these great examples is going to be Pyramid Lake Paiute artist Greg Deal's Duality of Indigeneity mural, which is in the city of Baltimore. In this piece, you can really get a sense of how the artist is confronting the idea of Indigenous peoples in an urban space. And he asks, which of these two figures is more Indigenous, right? And the answer is actually that they're equally Indigenous, right? Wearing one's traditional clothing does not make one any more or less Indigenous than a person who is dressed in more contemporary or urban street clothing. Next slide, please. So I hope through this very brief overview, you've gotten a sense of how I use mapping as a way to reclaim, defend, and decolonize. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll say Shabashki, and thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any and all questions about this project. Thank you.
Great. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. So I'll just quickly talk. I'm going to talk about the most recent thing I did, which is this book, which came out a little bit ago. And so next slide. Now let's actually go back. The art is done by a Navajo artist. You can look him up at OXDX Design. He has some stuff also in the museum downtown. He did some of the stuff for the Super Bowl, and he got a special contract to do that. Very good artist. I got this present. The next, just to give a background, I am not Indian. I grew up in part, but only in part, on the Navajo Reservation. I also grew up in lots of other places: Missouri, Iowa, Colorado, and Pennsylvania area. On the reservation, my dad lives now near Red Valley Cove, which is on in the middle of nowhere by reservation standards. Before that, he lived in Kayenta, which is right near Monument Valley. And my mother spent most of her career in Window Rock until she retired, and now she lives off the reservation. There's a photo of the Hogan that I stay at when I go visit, and Monument Valley is the part that people know, sort of Back to the Future. Next slide. You may also recognize this. This was in a Tom Hanks movie recently, and is in what movie is that? One of the Transformers movies. Next slide. In general, of course, the book that I first recommend, I sort of have my first book I always recommend is Divine and Gloria, Kissed Her Died for Your Sins, which is very short and very accessible and very funny. But the second book I recommend, if you're new to the topic, is Blood Struggle, which I think is a really good book on the last century. I was an Indian law person for a long time before I read that book, and it told me about people that I just didn't know about from that had been involved with their tribe. So next slide. This is where I know best, which is the Navajo Reservation. It's about the size of West Virginia or Ireland. And within it is the Hopi Reservation. When I was there, next slide. When I was there, the main issue that you felt in many ways was the lack of development. And so at the time that I was there was 11 stoplights in an area the size of West Virginia. Now there are more, but it's still the case that we saw this in COVID with the lack of running water. People are living on an income that is always in the 1/3 to a half of the United States. Unemployment is at 50%. Most people live, there's a huge number of people live without running water or electricity. So the conditions continue to be rough for people, especially if they're away from the cities. And that was my main interest in this. I should say the part that I usually start, Bill States heard this talk a number of times. So the Navajo word for white people is Biligana, which means white, the other, or the enemy. And when I was there was no question I was the enemy. My brother had to get a police escort on the bus to protect him as he moved back and forth from middle school. My experience was much better than that, and I was brown hair as opposed to blonde, and I also had a policy that you touch me, I tell, which was a better strategy than my brother's I fight back strategy. But the thing that is shocking still to me is the amount of wealth we have around the capital compared to the situation on the reservation. Keep going. So the book tells the story of a couple of things. It tells the story of the way the United States government killed the livestock that Navajos had. It first tells the conquest story, but then it moves beyond conquest and internment into the sort of present day with different uses of land, and that's what I thought would be most relevant here. So one of the things that happened is in the New Deal, the United States decided that Navajos had too many sheep, goats, and horses, and so they killed sheep, goats, and horses, often in front of their families, wiping out half of the wealth of many families. The tribal government got formed because the United States felt at that point that there needed to be a government to sign off on oil and gas leases. And so the Tribal Business Council eventually becomes the Navajo Nation Council, which eventually becomes the Navajo Nation government. And here we see some of the interest right in front of Shiprock for oil and gas. Next slide. The tribal government fights back against some of this, although they are rubber stamped for many of the leases. The next major moment was uranium. It's one book that we're in the Hall of Science, so I can say this without apology. The Making of the Atomic Bomb, if you haven't read it, is a fabulous book on how science works. I like to compare it to law, where in science, it turns out that if somebody writes something and other people learn from it and then they move ahead with the field, in law, somebody writes something and then we all pretend no, we didn't read it, we write the same thing again. We don't really learn in the same way as they do in other fields. The next major thing was uranium. And so uranium was not used for the bomb, it was after that, but the protections were not there for workers. And so workers were, even though we knew this was a problem, they were sent to do mining without respirators, without watering down of the material. And so people got sick. The high school that my father and his wife, who's Navajo, taught at was called the Miners. That was they picked their own mascot and they were celebrating their dead relatives. The Navajo Nation now prohibits mining for uranium, but right off the reservation, there are companies that want to do uranium mining. And it wasn't just the miners that were impacted. People would build their homes, their floors, out of uranium mining waste. And so people were literally sleeping on the waste and playing. Kids would play in piles of waste. And to this day, Shiprock, which is the town right next to my father, continues to have massive pilings that the United States government has not dealt with. And just this month, my dad's wife that has cancer is going to file a petition to say that she was impacted by some of this. So it is a real problem that affected a lot of the reservation. That's why. All right, next. The next major resource was coal. And so coal, I love this because it has both the traditional sheep herding and the coal there. But as others on the panel could tell you more about, the Navajo Nation engaged and the Hopi agreed to some deals with coal mining companies, but the deals were exploitative. And when the United States, when the U.S. Supreme Court heard a case challenging these deals, they essentially gave the United States a free pass despite clear wrongdoing against the interests of the tribe. Next slide. But coal still is a complicated one. People make their livelihoods in part by coal. I love this because it shows that at the top left, it shows the coal train, which ran between the coal mine and the power plant that polluted the Grand Canyon. But it also shows the trucks. And a worker for a coal mine might earn between 80 and 120 a year with just a high school degree. That person can support a large extended family, and they own the F-150s, the F-250s. So it was and is part of the culture. The Navajo Nation government, though my book tells the story about the rise of the government, it is the #1 employer on the reservation. But some of the problems, and I'll move quickly, some of the problems continue to exist. Overgrazing continues to be a problem. It was a problem when the way the U.S. government dealt with it. It since has been in the hands of the Navajo Nation, and there's still an overgrazing problem. So that has not been solved. Next. That's more on the overgrazing. There is a desertification that's happening. We're also in the middle, as everyone knows, of a massive drought for the area. Next slide. So one of the questions is, what do you do and what should you work on? My idea and my work tends to be grounded on only one tribe, because it's the only tribe that I feel I have any insight, and that's Navajo, and tries to be based on what reservation life is like there. It's not, I focus much less than most Indian law scholars on jurisdictional questions because I don't care. I care much more about economic development, and so that's my main focus. My other work, here you see a couple of things. I also work in poverty areas, which obviously overlaps with my tribal interest. And right now I'm working on the update to the Felix Cohen handbook, which is the major handbook in Indian law. They asked for volunteers, and I said, I am the least qualified because I'm the newest member of the editorial staff. I'm also white, so please go with any other volunteer. No one else volunteered, so that has been my life for the last 5 months. The downside is it turns out it's really hard to update the federal code. You have to do it one code section at a time. So March 15th is my celebration moment when I turn it in. Until then, my life sucks. And I think that's it. Is that it? Oh, so quickly on the ties of the school, we're now in the 12th year of a alternative spring break trip to the nomination. Here's the first group of this group, the one on the right, sort of Fidel looking. He went on to do Indian law. He now works on environmental things for the state of California. The one on the far left became a teacher at our school as an adjunct doing family law. The next two both did public interest, and I've lost touch with them. But next one. But there's been a number of groups. Here's though that group I couldn't tell you what they all did. Next one. There's another group. Keep going. There's the most recent group, and then another group is going to spring break. Next slide. I think we're almost done. So why all this matters, I think it's very easy, I think, to get comfortable in the lives we have here in DC, even if you're just middle class. Forget about being a top wealthy person. Life off the reservation is comfortable. And so we need to remind people that there are people living in conditions, in my mind, that would not be tolerated for any other group of Americans. And we continue to tolerate it, and we look the other way. Thank you. One more. I think we'll say thank you. No, we're supposed to say thank you. So there we go. Thank you. And I should say for the people that are undergrads, I am available. I didn't mention this. One of the great things to see is main campus care in a way that wasn't true for a very long time. And I will give credit to Elizabeth. It matters that there is somebody at the main campus who does this. We were joking earlier that there is a limited degree of connection between main campus and law school, and sometimes that degree of connection is deliberately limited. But it's been a while since we've had this sort of event. It never happened since 2006, and I really do credit Elizabeth and the school for hiring her.
Thanks, Ezra. And I have to agree on Elizabeth. I've been here since 2001 and have never been to anything like this. But I come to this a little differently. I'm an intellectual property lawyer. I had the amazing fortune to come here about 20 years ago to start an intellectual property clinic in our really wonderful clinical program at the law school, with colleagues working on access to justice issue in the information justice area. So access to the 2 prongs of access to justice, right? Access to the legal system by artists, scholars, filmmakers, and working on the justice piece, making the system, the IP, communication system, information policy system work better for all kinds of people. So we write amicus briefs, white papers, stuff like that, and we also represent filmmakers and do sort of normal IP work. So I've been doing that with students for 20 years, and it's been amazing. And one day I got an opportunity through my trademark law practice to write an amicus brief for Suzanne Harjo in the Washington football case that Elizabeth mentioned. And Suzanne is, I think every lawyer has a client that changed their life. This woman changed my life. From a 6-hour lunch with her down at Zatinya, sitting outside, hearing about her work as the head of NCII, her work on cultural property, most things done in the early, she was in the Carter administration from the early outset. And I was listening to Elizabeth saying, moving to Washington, Suzanne moved to Washington way long ago, and said some of the same things, encountered many of those same things. But one of those things she encountered, as y'all probably know, is the Washington football team name and mascot. And despite all her cultural work and all her wonderful work on monuments and repatriation and the stuff she did, she said to me, we can't do any of that until we change the perception of us. And if we're perceived as a mascot, we won't be able to do any of the important work. So she said this was her big domino. We needed this to go because it's here in the nation's capital. And as Kevin Gover of the museum says, the Indian you see most often in Washington, D.C. is at a football game until recently. At the expense of real Indians, real history, real culture, the petty stereotype has become expected. And that's, that's what Elizabeth's talking about in her mapping project. 60,000 people come to an NFL football game each week. 10 million households plus watch on television. We had a team with a native mascot win the Super Bowl this year, right? Most Americans, as Elizabeth says, have never met, at least in DC, in most areas of the country, have never met a native person. So what they learn and what they believe about them is from the imagery that I'm showing up here in a slideshow of no important order. It can just run. And so what I decided that I could do is help with this case. So I've helped with the Supreme Court amicus, and that's how I got involved. That's how I met Suzanne. And during my teaching, I always want our students to wrestle with the language in our Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to dignity, and to freely participate in the cultural life of the community is always in tension with the right to protection and of your moral and material interests, right? There's this delicate balance, but the right to dignity that I sort of seized on and couldn't get out of my head from my relationship with Suzanne in working on a very legal thing called latches that the plaintiffs, Suzanne and her colleagues, had slept on their rights in the law, so they couldn't challenge. So it was thrown out of court, a long challenge. And the history of the case is fascinating, and I won't belabor it here, but I was working on a pretty small thing, basically saying what I thought was a fairly just and reasonable thing. Some things latches shouldn't apply to, right? And someone will always be born into this cause of action every day. So why would you bar it from these plaintiffs from doing it? So that was at the Supreme Court. We lost that case, but I got more interested. And as you know, the story continued. And even though in another Supreme Court case, a law that used to ban disparaging trademarks, you could not own a federal property right in a name or image that was deemed disparaging, was deemed unconstitutional by our Supreme Court in a very different case, but the law went away. What happened when that law went away is Suzanne's challenge became moot. The football team could keep the mascot. And they did for a while, even after she had been going to the team when it moved to Washington. Edward Bennett Williams, she had visited him. She had been working on this for decades. Finally, public opinion turned around, the sponsors turned around, and then you all know the end of the stories. So they changed the name, we got the Washington Commanders. We still get all the negative imagery of the fan imagery that happens at the game. Some people don't want to give it up. I still see clothing and paraphernalia around town. But that ability to write your story, right? And that's what Suzanne taught me. You don't have the power over the story that dominates your life, the power to retell it, to deconstruct it, to joke about it, to change it if you want to. You're powerless. And the imagery of a mascot is so dehumanizing. If you think about what's the typical mascot, it's pets, animals, things, something that's something other than human, right? And it stuck with me. She said to me, Vicki, look at the Department of Interior organizational chart. Fish, wildlife, Indians. We're all mascots. And this kind of harm, I started to think about, like, this is so beyond trademark law. Even though I'm an IP lawyer, this is so pernicious. And the Washington story, was just the beginning of it to me. And then I started reading psychologist Stephanie Freiberg's studies, the use of mascots, the harm on kids. I had 2 young kids at the time. They're 20 years old now. I've been working on this their whole life, right? This issue, and it's still continuing, as you all know. Just the lower self-esteem for the kids, the higher self-esteem it gives non-native communities because the power they feel over others, correlating to horrible stuff on the reservation, high suicide rates, depression, the APA, all the organizations that tried to get these teams to change their names, and the NCAA finally was determined. You don't see this. The colleges made change in the 70s on the heels of the civil rights movement because we are academic places and we are not corporate enterprises, hopefully. So many of those names were changed on the heels of that. And my students, I got my clinic students involved in this. We wrote a paper for a symposium the museum had, I think it was in 2013, on mascotting when we were in the battle on this case. And my students wrote a really nice white paper about the stories. One of my things with my students is lawyering is storytelling, it's narrative. And one of the things they did was they wrote a white paper about the changes at Little Red at Oklahoma, where Suzanne is from. The Stanford Indian was changed. The Syracuse mascot, the Dartmouth Indian. We told the stories of those for this symposium, and at the time there still is so much student activism. Cooperstown was doing a big project that time. Port Townsend. Then I found out one of my colleagues on the faculty who's no longer here was actually the mascot at the Port Townsend High School. He dressed up as the mascot, and that he said, "I can't even believe I did that." So I just kept working in this area because it was so important to me. And in a year later, I went and wrote a report with the Center for American Progress here downtown with a native staffer, a guy named Eric Stegman, called Missing the Point, the Real Impact of Native Mascots and Team Names on American Indian and Alaska Native Youth. And we conducted these, we went and did some more current research, first person interviews with Native youth about the effects of the mascots that just, as you see from the slides, they're still at high schools, they're still at elementary schools, and the stories were really powerful. We got the report out, we started to do a little advocacy with it, and we got the White House and the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights to do a listening tour on the issue of mascots. And it's Washington. Stuff takes a long time. And we're hopeful that, I think now it's something like two-thirds of the mascots I think have been changed. So wheels of the arc of justice, it's slow, but I think Suzanne was right. I mean, I'll end with, I think she was right, thinking if the big one fell, then we know what the Cleveland mascot was retired, Chief Wahoo, the Cleveland Indians. I think we're going to someday be able to turn back and see the elimination of harmful racist native mascots. I hope. But it's been a journey for me, and I'm just so indebted to the work of all the folks on this panel, because it's, as an IP lawyer, it's some of the most important work I've ever done, for sure. Thank you. I killed it.
I have a loud voice, so I won't hold it then. First of all, I'm really honored to be here. I will try to stifle a little bit of the imposter syndrome that I'm feeling right now, because I never started out and still don't even consider myself a tribal legal expert at all. But over the course of my 30 years, first I was with Defenders of Wildlife, I worked on wolves and grizzly bears with tribes, and many of us probably know about the tribes of the Pacific Northwest and salmon restoration. There's bison. The fact that we now have a Secretary of Interior who is the first ever Native American, which is, I think, a full circle of something very exciting. By the way, I want to thank the Center for Environment and Community Equity. I should have CC. Thank you for doing this. But I'm going to talk about two stories today, relatively quick stories, and I apologize. There are lots of beautiful photos I could be showing of both of the places I'm going to describe. I just was not on the ball with that. So just have to, I'll try to describe it, and you can imagine it in your mind. And these two stories, to me anyway, represent two examples of larger legal windows by which tribal advocates and their allies, I think, can advance tribal rights and tribal rights and associated rights, because the way I look at it is that I'm in alignment with tribes very frequently on issues, and that's how I've gotten to work with various tribes, is I'm already working on a water issue or a wildlife issue, and tribes or a tribe inevitably is working, and I try to find alignment, and it's been a 30-year process. I still feel like I'm in kindergarten, on that evolution of integration, but it has been inspiring the way that you described. It has changed my life in a very real way. So let me tell you what the two avenues are, and then I'll give the stories. So as was the case in a recent Supreme Court decision regarding Oklahoma tribal rights, tribal treaty rights are now being relooked at and interpreted in a way that I think is much less biased and I don't want to say more favorable to tribes, but interpreting these treaties in a way that actually recognizes plain words. And that's particularly true with fishing rights. It's true with various other notions of sovereignty. And so I think pushing, and it's true with water rights, huge, not only fishing, but farming and other use in the Intermountain West. So I think one avenue is to push treaties. There are a lot of treaties out there, and for many years they were sort of ignored or cast aside, but they have power and they're binding law upon the United States, upon everyone. So that's one angle. And then the other angle is the protection and honoring of sacred sites, religious freedom and religious liberty, which is also, I think, very important. And Religious Freedom Restoration Act in the early 90s is being used right now by tribes to advance the rights. So here are my two stories. The first is relating to minerals on tribal land, the Apache in San Carlos Apache in Arizona. For many years have used the Oak Flat area. It's not a part of the reservation, but it's on national forest land to perform sacred rites. They do a lot of things there, not all of which I know, have been told, or understand, but I do know, for example, young women are taken there when they're going to have their first period. It's one of many things that occurs at this place. It is of huge sacred importance to the Apache. And the federal government for many years understood this and resisted attempts by foreign mining companies to dig for copper that is underneath this sacred site. And by the way, this is where beautiful pictures. This area would blow your mind. It is remote. It has fresh water in these pools and the mountains. Like it's as close to heaven as anything place I've ever actually been. I'm getting chills. It's an amazingly beautiful place, in addition to the sacredness of for the tribal members. Well, in 2000, after all of this, and there was sort of an unwritten understanding that we will not do that. John McCain put a rider on a defense spending bill in 2015. These are one of these huge mega bills, the defense bill every year, where you got to pass it, or it's perceived you got to pass it. And if you put it, McCain was chairman of the defense committee. He put the rider on. It was literally passed at 11:30 at night. I mean, it happened fast. It wasn't democratic, small d democratic. There was no in fact, all the hearings and processes up to that point, the majority had been opposed to this. But McCain stuck it in. It became law. And what it is, it's an exchange between Forest Service land, and they're going to give it to a big Australian mining company called Rio Tinto. It has a couple different corporate names, but Rio Tinto is the one that it's most commonly known by. And it hasn't happened yet. There's a series of court battles that have been ensuing. But the one court battle I want to tell you about that's relevant, there'll be a hearing in the Ninth Circuit en banc, which is meaning the entire Ninth Circuit is going to be deliberating on March 23rd, literally a month from today. It's a Thursday, I believe that's March 23rd. And the issue is that the tribe is arguing, it's actually Apache Stronghold, which is a nonprofit associated with the tribe. They're arguing that the inability to perform their religious rights on this land violates the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And I don't want to predict, I mean, at the panel level, when it was just the three judges, the Apache Stronghold lost 2-1. But the dissent was very strong, and I think that's why the full panel took it up. But it would be historic, huge, if the Apache Stronghold wins this. And I don't know if Ezra has a feel for it. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I wouldn't at all predict a win. But the fact that we're having the argument, the fact that the whole panel wants to hear this, the fact that the dissent by Judge Berzon was so strong, I have it right here, I'm not going to read from it, we'd be here a while, is, hopeful. We're hoping. And we got good lawyers, and a lot of interest, so many interesting bed partners, all sorts of religious advocates have thrown their weight behind the Apache stronghold. So we'll see what happens with that. It's very excited, and we've urged, many advocates have urged for President then Obama, we sort of skipped the next one on this issue, and then with Biden, to have an executive order on sacred sites. The president has a lot of authority to protect sacred sites on public land, and we're hoping that eventually occurs. So that's one story that I hope ends well, but we're on the precipice. It's the fact that we're this far is really scary and telling. So that's one story. The second story relates to treaty rights and water rights, and this was, I've been involved in Colorado River issues, Ezra mentioned it a little bit, in the Navajo drought sense for 30 years of my life. And the Colorado River in the West is undergoing a historic drought. I actually hesitate to call it that because I think it's a realignment of what probably is going to be the new future. I don't think it's a drought. I think it's the new dry. I think it's just the way it is now, for better or for worse, likely worse. And we know the adage in the West about water. I think Mark Twain is coined with it, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting over. And that's absolutely true. During the Trump administration, well, there's a tributary to the Colorado River called the Green River, which I just went to this summer, amazingly beautiful itself, which I had thought to bring pictures. And the Green River is a part of the Colorado River legal structure. And during the Trump era, the Trump administration decided with the Utah delegation that in this time of new dry, where no one has water, in fact, they're turning off spigots in Arizona because there's not enough water in the system. They gave the state of Utah 60,000 acre feet of water, which, to put in perspective, would be enough water for about 100,000 homes over the course of a year. It's a lot of water, especially in an area that is so parched. And they gave Utah this water. The environmental analysis was completely BS, but that's sort of, that's sort of old hat. What was most infuriating, and the reason I got to work with the Ute tribe on this particular issue, and in fact, there's a related Navajo case that Professor Rosser has written an amicus brief on, participated on, was basically they gave this water to Utah, but the Ute tribe has water rights hundreds of years more senior than Utah, about 100 years more senior. And it was just ignored, like Orwellian ignored. Oh, we'll deal with that later. What do you mean you deal with it later? It's 60,000, would there not be any more water left? What do you mean we'll deal with this? Like, you're giving Utah 60,000 acre feet for new communities, and you're blowing off a tribe that has senior water rights by 100 years? And yep. And we fought that when there was the transfer of administrations, we pleaded with the Justice Department and Interior Department. I don't think it went as high as the Secretary. I'm hopeful she would have said no to this. Biden administration was not interested in changing. No, we're litigating. We'd already lost the district court decision at that point. So the Biden administration has their hand on this a little bit too. The Bureau of Reclamation is definitely an old, stodgy agency. And so I just argued before the 10th Circuit a month ago on the fact that the Trump administration, well, the Bureau of Reclamation, I didn't make it political, had completely ignored the new dry reality, had completely ignored the Ute tribe, and the Utes had submitted an amicus brief on our behalf, a really amazing amicus brief on our behalf. I got to know the lawyers who were incredible lawyers. And again, only a fool litigator predicts victory, but I am cautiously optimistic we will maybe get that decision remanded back. But these are treaty rights. These are the Utes' water rights are based on treaties with the United States. So I guess both my stories are not happy stories yet, but I think they are indicative of a couple of things, of the battles that tribes face in the United States, at least in natural resources, which I'm more expert in. It shows the powerful and growing alignment between heretofore, white groups or non-native groups with tribes and tribal groups to achieve common cause. And I really want to win both these fights a lot. So whatever happens with those two, I think this alignment is historic. Like I hope it will continue. And it's a synergy that did not exist when I was a young lawyer. And so I'm very optimistic that there'll be more of this and not less of this. And I'm really honored to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you all so much. This is just so exciting to have this on campus, so excited to just hear all of this work. It's so wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and open it to larger Q&A, and I'll save my questions for the last question. Yeah.
So I have questions for a lot of you, but I'll just ask one question. Professor Rule, I was fantastically interested in this great multimedia combination of resources, scholarly books, maps, apps. So I just want to go on some of the maps. And I just have any questions for you. So I want to draw out some more of your thinking around maps, mapping, and cartography, or generally just thinking about sort of the cartographic mode as something that historically, of course, has had an extremely problematic effect in struggles over resources of land, and which is often used even now by powerful entities to overlay a determinative narrative about a circumstance and as perhaps the most powerful way of knowing is kind of visual meaning and specificity. So your project is in varieties of ways cutting it in something like the opposite direction of that. But how do you think about that? Maps as an intervention given the sort of history of maps.
Right, sure, absolutely. And, I should say also that this is only one part of my work. I have quite a different project that's focusing on gender-based violence and reproductive justice and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis. And in that project, I attend to these issues that you're identifying, right? The problems of maps, how maps exist in many ways as colonial instruments to justify things like, the nation state, and oftentimes cut through tribal territories. So in that project, I very concretely think about resisting something like the US, Canada, national borders, and I'm thinking more broadly, and rooted in an indigenous epistemology about the concept of Turtle Island, right? So then when I'm doing a project that's rooted in maps, right, how do I bring that in? On somewhat of a basic level, part of the intervention I'm trying to make with the use of maps is talking about spatiality and land and territory, while also playing with, or in some ways collapsing, temporality, right? So having, for example, historical sites next to contemporary sites, next to things like sites of the future, right, are one of the ways in which I'm trying to make a broader statement about territory and territory from an Indigenous perspective, right? So to give you a sense of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the future, because I've gestured toward this a couple of times now, one of the sites that was included on my guide to Indigenous DC was the National Native American Veterans Memorial, right? And this is a new memorial that sits on the grounds of the National Museum of the American Indian. And at the time that I published the Guide to Indigenous DC app and map, it was 2019, and there were all of the construction plans in place and set into motion for creating this new Veterans Memorial. So I decided, okay, I'm just gonna go ahead and include it on this map, and then by the time it's actually published, it will exist and everything will go fine. I won't have to go back in and edit too quickly, right? Well, then COVID happens, right? And construction on this memorial halts, and it halts for over a year, right? And so what this left me in a position of was having a map, right, that had a pinpoint, right, of a site that didn't actually yet exist, right? And so in that way, again, I was confronted as a researcher as part of my own process of thinking through how are we going to include both historical and contemporary sites, but what does it also mean to have the constant reemergence of new sites and places, and even what does it mean to represent that through something like a small pinpoint on a map, right? And in what ways does that speak to Indigenous futurity in this area? some of the features and desire to do mapping projects are also in order to generate public user interest, right? So there are a variety of ways that people can engage these and actually utilize them as educational materials. You can geolocate yourself in proximity to these sites. So that's something, of course, that's designed with the actual user audience in mind. But then there's also features like virtual modes, right? Where people from anywhere in the world can do a virtual walking tour of these places and utilize 360-degree sort of on the ground imaging technologies. So those are some of the ways that I'm thinking about mapping. I mean, one of the interesting things that has come up also is that, for example, a project like the Guide to Indigenous Maryland. Obviously, in that case, we're working within like the settler colonial boundaries of the state of Maryland, right? But part of that I've accepted as, you know, a concession, right, that I'm willing to make because of the avenues that it opens, right? So getting it into things like public schools in Maryland, right, is important to me. And to do that, the framing of the state becomes important. So there are many contours to mapping, and those are some of my broad thoughts about it.
I have some others. To see more.
I have a general question about curriculum development. As some of the students have shown, there's been a wave of Indigenous content and Indigenous created content in curriculum, broader higher education, but at AU. And so in your experiences teaching at the law school and also in art and sciences, how have you, I guess the question is, there's so much interest, but so much in collective ignorance, there's just erasure to work through. So has it been, what has been the experience of teaching and developing doing curriculum with the foundation of cultural ignorance and erasure, you know, as a starting point, but also this burgeoning interest?
I'll say a little bit. One thing that, you know, if I think about where the future could go on main campus and connection with the law school, right now we just don't see undergrads take any law school classes. And there, at my other schools where, you know, I went to school, there were undergrads in their last year who could take the upper level federal Indian law class. I think some undergrads could do that. And the question is, how does the law school administration and main campus administration work out the funding or the whatever deal has to be done for that to be okay? But I think if you were, for a number of majors, you could have a cross-listed thing that would work for that. My experience on the other more informal connections with main campus are the capstone projects, where they have a native capstone and they can find me. And that's much more haphazard and still, it's because it's controlled by the greater main campus, it doesn't feel like it's really mine. And so I would love to see a way in which students would have that be available. I think it's about the number of classes and the number of students that are going to be interested in any particular thing. It's to justify a full course. And that's always the challenge with at least the number of native students. We don't get native students. We get very, very few native students on law school. And so in defense of a law school, if you are native, I think that we do provide a good program, but it's done through independent studies, which is a burden on the faculty. So I routinely supervise independent studies in a way that gets 0 credit. I think it's fair to say at our school, and having some way to protect Elizabeth from that sort of demand, or I'd like to be noticed if I do that as well. So, and that's on the administration. Do they give credit for independent studies? And the answer at our school is no. And so for that reason, we have a lot of faculty that turn down even supervising the required thing that students have to do to graduate. And that's a problem as an administration. Students will have an idea and they will go to 5 different professors, and I won't pick on any area, but let's just say IP, and they will miss, right? They won't find someone, or they'll go to, who's the person who, this will give them name, but education law, we have okay people, but those people always say no because there's no credit. That's a problem. And so finding a way in which to deal with that will help students, but it does involve the administration having to take credit.
I have a minor point, but I want to defer because that was deep and mine isn't at that level. So I want to see if
Ezra's what Ezra said, I agree with. It would be very cool to be able to do that. I mean, I have increased, and maybe it's because of Ezra, or maybe it's just the the awakening, right? I have increasing numbers of students interested in this area, and not generally not native, but a number of students are in Ezra's class that, sometimes it's the case, but not always. They're going to the Navajo Nation with you and or on that trip. Yeah, yeah. So I think more of that cross pollination would be good, but.
So there's one simple thing that I've done that I didn't want to tout it as too big a deal because it's just a little piece, but it's, I think, a little piece that all of us as professors can do. At least my professors are doing full-time Indigenous work. Of course you're going to do it. But like, as you're mapping, like, I didn't know Ira Hayes was there. Like, if you just look at climate change law, federal public land law, property law, you just look for the Indian cases, they're there. And so, for instance, I'll give you two examples. The very first case in one of the property law texts that both Professor Ross and I use is Johnson v. McIntosh, which is having its 100th year anniversary, unfortunately, this year. And it was basically a case that said that even though the rule of law is first in time means you have the property, if you're an Indian, if it's Indian title, that doesn't work. It's got to be white title. Horrible decision, like not defensible on any level. And so I used to cover it and get the hell out of Dodge as fast as I could. Oh, this is me. And now I focus on it, and I get people uncomfortable. Like, I just, and then it inspires and I keep referring to it the whole semester. And so that's one thing I've done. And it's little, but I think it's helped. I think it's given richness to the overall cultural aspect of property. And then relating to what I just talked about with water rights and the Colorado River, I bring in the cases I'm working on and have them see it from a tribal perspective, because that is a hugely important perspective. And I think, again, not a get-all solution. I think some of the larger issues on the table, but we all have the power to do that in our classes. And I think it's all there for us if we just look, is my feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then like I mentioned, I'm in critical race, gender, and culture studies, and within that umbrella department, I teach primarily in American studies and also a bit in women's gender sexuality studies. So I teach a couple of courses that specifically take up Indigenous content. So I teach one course called American Indian Law and Legacies, which begins with the Marshall Trilogy and the Constitution and moves forward, always linking historical, legislative, and political and legal developments with how is this affecting contemporary Indigenous lived experience. I also teach courses in Native women's and Indigenous feminist thought. And I'll just echo what everyone has said, which is that there is really a high demand and burgeoning interest among the student body for these types of courses. I have teams of RAs and, requests for summer studies, for example, flowing in, which is wonderful, right? To know of this interest. And I'm really happy that they're finding me and hopefully other resources at the university. But I think that there are also really important areas for growth too. I mean, on Monday, for example, I was meeting with the National Congress of American Indians and Center for Native American Youth, and they bring a youth council, right, who's acting again as sort of young ambassadors and delegates to Washington, D.C., again, because this is where so many of these decisions and changes happen that reverberate throughout Indian country. And as I was speaking to the students, to the youth, right, one of them was a high school student who said, okay, you're at American University. Can you tell us about the Indigenous Studies program? And, it was a pretty quick conversation. So I think that's the kind of missed opportunity that we have, right? Because there is interest, there's interest from outside. Like you said, we don't have hardly any Native American student representation on campus, but that doesn't mean that they're not interested, right? It means that the institution can do more to meet their needs, because there are going to be institutions that are going to appeal to those very high achieving, very capable Indigenous students.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm gonna, so we are at times when I close this out here. I think what has been so powerful about this panel is each of you are doing work in different areas, but it's so overlapping, and this the constant of themes and how people are seen and perceived, and when and where across the spatiality of it, the temporality of it, factors into how certain lands are protected, or how mascots are made or not, and how that then impacts the environment we're talking about. And also, it's so fascinating to see the connection between the work that you're doing, for example, bringing students from here to the reservation, because kind of tying into your point that so many people have never even met Indigenous right? And so bringing that visibility in a very tangible way. And so it's just so powerful how all of this, even across different spaces, connects to each other in this very strong way. And there's just the four of you sitting here, right? We can have, like you're saying, we have so much more, so much visibility. And so to close out, my question is just, what should or could AU do? What is your dream for that? And not hopes and dreams.
Can I take the question on, Veronica?
Yeah.
Just to put a finer point on the question, maybe from the center perspective, as
Yeah.
the cross-campus center gets its legs under it. So it's great to hear about individual work. What can a cross-campus center do to support, elevate, make more visible that individual work?
And support hiring.
Right, and support hiring. And then
Probably the answer.
second part of it, is there a project that we can imagine that draws on your shared expertise? Is there something we can look to do together? That could really do that.
So, I mean, I'll just say one thing, which is, and this is in line with the postdoc, it depends on the resources in the center. But if there are students that want to do something, having an answer to that demand, and this was Elizabeth's point as well, is valuable. And that means not simply redirecting them, right? So if there is a student that's interested in some particular thing that we don't offer, the main inclination is to redirect them to something we do offer. But if there's a way in which to not have to redirect them, that's valuable. And that basically needs somebody to own it. It doesn't need to be even that many, but somebody to own, here are tribal needs that we could put student labor into or work into. So that would be my answer. I don't know others.
I don't have a better one than that.
Yeah, I mean, just building on that, right? Depending on resource availability, residencies, postdocs, visiting scholar positions, scholarships. AU used to operate the WINS program, Washington Internships for Native Students, which it no longer does, right? I sort of spoke at length about the importance of DC as a place where Native youth come, just like I was talking about that council, right? They come here, and many of them are seeking an opportunity to stay, work, learn, study, and be involved on that federal level. But that's an area where the university could really get involved and support, even with something like a summer internship program that, again, we have all the framework for having in the past. And then final thing would be hiring Indigenous staff people to support the center, right? And also supporting Indigenous speakers to come and paying them handsomely.
All that.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're at time, right? Thank you so much, and everyone.
fantastic.
Elizabeth, it was so nice to meet you.
Yes,
Yeah.
likewise.
I'll be sending an email or two your way in the coming weeks.
Oh, please.
I don't know of what yet, but I'm so glad that you're here.
Well, likewise, and